Okay, hello everyone who are participating in today's symposium online. My name is Dong-Kyun Im, and I'm a professor at the Department of Sociology at Seoul National University. And I'm happy to moderate today's webinar, whose title is Navigating Population Dynamics, Innovative Approaches for the Future. And we have three very exciting presentations for today. So for those of you who are not familiar with our research center and today's symposium, I'm going to provide you a little bit of background. So this 1010 initiative, or also known as the 1010 project, is a collaborative effort between the Department of Sociology and Department of Social Welfare at Seoul National University. This joint program launched in 2020, and the project aims to generate insights and policy ideas to address South Korea's rapidly evolving demographic landscape. And as many of you know, Korea faces significant demographic challenges with the lowest fertility rates in the world and an accelerating shift toward an aging society. So since its inception, 1010 Initiative has hosted annual symposiums and lecture series, bringing together scholars to explore these pressing issues. So today, we are very excited to kick off this year's symposium with an outstanding lineup of experts. So we have 100 minutes in total for presentation, including Q&A. And we have three presenters, so it would be great if each presenter can finish their presentations within about 25 minutes. So for those of you listening to this on YouTube, you can leave your comments or questions in the chat box or comment sections on YouTube. I will collect them and deliver those questions and comments to the speakers during our Q&A session after all the presentations are made. So we're going to start with the first presentation will be delivered by Dr. Ann Gujon. So Ann Gujon is a program director and principal research scholar for the Population and Justice Society's program at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. And Dr. Gujon is a demographer, and she received her PhD in social and economic science from the University of Vienna, Austria, in 2003. So she first joined the former IASA World Population Program in January 1994 as a research assistant, and since 2002, she has also been a researcher at the Vienna Institute of Demography, which belongs to Austrian Academy of Sciences, where she leads the Human Capital Data Lab. And from March 2020 to March 2022, she worked as a researcher in the Knowledge Center of Migration and Demography at the European Commission Joint Research Center in Ispra, Italy. So Dr. Gujon's scientific interests lie in the macro-level analysis and projections of background characteristics of the population acquired during childhood that rarely change once an individual has emancipated from parental control, and such as education and religion. And she has applied the methodology of multi-state population projections to many settings using scenarios to show the impact of the long-term dynamics of demographic change on these characteristics, and conversely, the impact of heterogeneous demographic behaviors of these groups on the overall population. So maybe the introduction was a little bit too long. So without further ado, let's please welcome Dr. Gujon.
Thank you very much for the long introduction, and sorry, probably I wrote it myself, so I should have made it shorter. So today what I'm going to present here is I'm going to give a global perspective, so not focus so much on the case of Korea, but look at what population projections, population projections are saying at the moment. So just a recap, why do we need population projections? First of all, it's a good toolbox to think about the implications of present and upcoming trends and the shifts in population size and structure, because these are key for understanding the different changes, the different developments that occur in society. So, as we know, like humans are actors of change, and they are also vulnerable to these changes. And these are important to look into the future, and they are strategic for policy formulation. I always make the distinction when I talk about projections to make sure that people understand what we are talking about. We're not talking about predictions. We don't know. This is not scientific. We don't know what the future is going to be. We also don't talk about forecasts. So national statistical institutes do forecasts. So they look at likely future from the present perspective. What I'm going to talk about is mostly about projections. So like looking at implementing what-if scenarios, different scenarios that show implications of different pathways that the population would take. So this is how the population would look like according to the United Nations, as it was published recently in 2024. So we see that the global population, according to the median trajectory, median scenario, would start declining in the second half of the century. And it would be around 10 billion by 2100. And according to the probabilistic scenarios of the United Nations, so if we look at the 95% over the 80% prediction interval, then we can see that the population would be in between 9 billion and 11 billion. So 1 billion centered around this 10 billion that I mentioned about. The change that we see and what we project for the future somehow follow the demographic transition theory, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. So this is the theory that explains how societies move from high fertility, high mortality rates in ancient times to a low fertility, low mortality rates in the course of development, in the course of a diffusion of media, of what we call modern ways of living, and also diffusion of education. And there is quite a difference at the stage at which different regions in the world are. So if we look at more developed regions on the left-hand side of this graph, then we can see that already from 2024, where we are now at, we are in a stage of at the very end where we have natural decrease. And this is how this is planned according to the United Nations. Whereas in less developed regions, because birth rates usually fall before death rates, death rates usually fall before birth rate, and we have high population growth. And this is what is happening at the moment in less developed region, where we have still a very high population growth. And the natural decrease basically is only forecasted towards the end of the century. And this is how it looks like at this level of the different regions. As you can see here, in greenish color, you have population change in between 2024 and 2050. And in orange color, you have a change between 2024 and 2100. And what you can see here is that most regions will have very low population growth in the course of a century. It will be a decline, as you mentioned, in Eastern and Southeastern Asia. And most of the population growth will happen in Southern Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in Northern Africa and Western Asia. And especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where like 3/4 of population growth to the end of the century will be on this subcontinent. So what we do in our work at IASA and at the Wittgenstein Center in general is looking at the impact that human capital and education would have on this phenomenon. And what we come up with in the end, our main finding is that these human capital and education are key. So we did some work, and this is not on Korea, but I think it could very much be relevant for South Korea as well. Is that we look at the labor force participation in the European Union for different education categories, and especially distinguishing between men and women. And at the level of these 28 countries in Europe, what we see is that labor force participation is very high, but there's still a differential by levels of education, less educated being less likely to be participating in the labor force, and women even more in that case, and with having lower participation level than men. And from what I know in Korea, the situation is similar, with about like 20 percentage point difference in labor force participation between men and women. When we take these values and try to do projections, and looking, for instance, at the labor force dependency ratio, which is the dependency ratio of the one who are not in the labor force to those who are in the labor force to 2060, and this is the right-hand graph. And we try different scenario, a constant scenario where we keep the labor force participation of both men and women in the labor force. These are the blue lines. You see that the dependency ratio increase quite fast. When we do the orange line, an equalization scenario, so imagining that the women reach the labor force participation of men at each education level with an increase in education, then we can see that this dependency ratio decline. And when we apply a Swedish scenario, where in Sweden men and women have one of the highest labor force participation rates in Europe, then we can see, this is the this line at the end, that there is a decline in actually or stabilization and a decline toward the end toward 2060 in labor force dependency ratio. And this has huge impact on the productivity and other areas. When we look at human capital and education in less developed countries, I mean, these productivity gains also are there, but we especially look in the way of how it would accelerate the demographic transition. So how it would accelerate these regions to have a lower population growth. And this is because education is a key parameter in explaining fertility behavior, especially when there's a high fertility. So we can see here, for instance, this represents fertility, the TFR, the total fertility rate, so the number of children of women, basically. And we can see that at high levels of fertility, the differentials between women with high education and low education is very high. For instance, in Niger, there's a difference of 4 children, so between 8 and 4 women with no education and 4 for women with low education. And the difference diminishes as the fertility decline, but there is still in less developed regions very high differentials. And this is also important for the side of mortality, because the maternal education determines infant and child mortality, as you can see on this graph as well, which is showing in the black square the infant mortality rate, and in the high and lows are representing the difference between the education of women, the mortality of infant, depending on the mother's education level. So what we have also is beyond that education has a role to play in beyond demography, and this role that it plays is very important for vulnerability to climate change, because at societal level, it's important, as we've seen before, but it's also at individual level. With education, there is an enhancement of cognitive skills. It changes risky behavior, extend the planning horizon. You can also, people with more education, learn from past damages, as has been shown, for instance, in Thailand after the tsunami and so on. And they have a better access to information, and overall, it's important for improvement of health, physical well-being, and higher income levels. So what do we do with this, taking into consideration that education plays a role, is that we do projections that include as a variable levels of education. And we follow 7 scenarios in our projections that follow the shared socioeconomic pathways. I will talk about this in a little while. We have done so far 3 rounds of global population projections. The last one was in 2023. It was published in 2024. The data is available at this website. You can write to me if you have not time to find it. And what we do is the modeling that we follow is that we use a model to project based on the experience of countries, but we also ask experts and meta experts for their opinion about the future of the different components of the projections: fertility, mortality, and migration. And as mentioned, we distinguish between age, sex, and education, and we have 6 levels of education. This is a documentation where you can find all the information. And what we do for projecting is that we follow the shared socioeconomic pathways. So these are our scenarios, and the shared socioeconomic pathways originate from the climate community, and they look at 5 different ways in which the world might evolve in the absence of climate policy. But how different levels of climate change mitigation could then be achieved when the mitigation targets that are about scenarios, emission on scenario emissions, are combined with the SSP. So you have this landscape of scenario. Our middle of the road scenario is this SSP2, where basically everything stays the same. We have 2 scenarios that have low socioeconomic challenges for adaptation: SSP1, sustainability, so this is the green road, and the SSP5, which is like taking the highway, basically continuing and using fossil fuel development, so maintaining our high energy consumption ways. And on the other hand, scenarios that are very difficult in terms of adaptation, SSP3 and SSP4. And for these scenarios that were developed in collaboration with the climate community, and that are, I forgot to mention, that are being used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we developed narratives for the demography and made scenarios about the different components of fertility, mortality, migration, and, as mentioned, education, following some scenarios about how societies would reach the sustainable development goals in terms of education, having everyone having a secondary education degree, for instance, or contrary, stalling education, like having, in the case of SSP3, for instance, having a constant enrollment rate scenarios. Just to say, like in terms of global population projections, there are 5 main actors, and I would say there are 3 main actors. The United Nations Population Division is the one whose projections are the most used. A newcomer is the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation that published just one round of projections, but that made a big splash in 2022. And the IASA and the Wittgenstein Center, who I'm representing here, and also like the U.S. Census Bureau and Population Reference Bureau somehow do also global population projections, but they are possibly less used and with very few scenario. So this is how the population would look like into the future according to these different scenarios. You have the red one is this IHME. The SSP2, so the recent one is this line, this brownish line. And I have also represented the old SSP2, so like the 2013 and 2018 18 round. And you have the UN, which is up there, and I'm not going to say anything about the others. So one important aspect is that at each revision, which is in 5-year step, basically our population projections has become higher and the peak has become later. So that nowadays we are at a peak that went over 10 billion and at a population which is almost at 10 billion at the end of the century. And this is due to two main reasons. One is that we underestimated mortality decline in the global south that happened in these last 10 years with a diminution of the death due to HIV/AIDS, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and with the spread of vaccination, immunization, and services, health services for maternal health and young children health that caused important decline in infant and child mortality in this thing. And the other thing why we are higher is also because we overestimated the fertility decline in the global south, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and also in some areas of South Asia, like Pakistan. But we can see still that most projections show that the world would peak within the 21st century. It would peak at different times. So IHME has it peaking almost close to 2060, whereas the UN has it peaking in 2080, above 2080. An important part is if we look at the different scenario that I was talking about, we can see how different futures would be in place. So if we take into consideration the two scenarios where education is very high, so SSP1 and SSP5, so achieving everywhere the sustainable development goals, more or less, then this is this population. So you will have a population because of the impact of education on fertility, among other things, the population would be way lower. In a scenario where, on the contrary, development is stalled and education is stalled, then we would have a population which would be much, much higher, above 13 million in 2100. So this is how the world population looks like in 2020 by levels of education. So with a still large, very quite large base, meaning that there's still population growth going on, but with an increase in levels of educational attainment, particularly among the younger population, the younger cohorts who have most, in majority, an upper secondary or post-secondary education. So this is this blue color. By 2100, the population would be 9.9 billion, and the world population would be much more educated if we follow this SSP2 scenario, which is not no investment scenario, which implies quite an increase in education levels for especially for the global south. And This is how the different scenario show the global population in 2100, where depending on the scenario, a shrinking population, SSP1 and SSP5, high population growth and low education levels, but still some improvement due to the past recent improvements in education in 2000 in SSP3 and SSP4. And this is how the population it looks like in 2020, where we have here is highlighted South Korea, where we can already see the base of the pyramid declining, but very extremely high levels of education in South Korea, which is again saying something about what I said before about the potential of these education levels for countering some of the issues that are present with a declining population. And this is a population in 2100 in the whole world. So you can see this huge increase that would be in place if we follow the middle scenario, which again, as mentioned, doesn't mean no investment in education, but like quite important investment in education. Another important impact, another important aspect is, and which is a bit a limitation of this exercise, is that doesn't say anything about, it's just about education attainment, so the quantity of education, but it doesn't say much about the education quality. And what we've noticed mainly in the Global South is at the moment there is an increase in school quantity at the expense of school quality, which can be measured by the increase in the pupil-teacher ratio and also in the decline in skill as measured by different measurements, by different exercise in looking at skills type PISA and also in adult population. So there could be an issue with that. So far, there are very few articles, scientific articles that show that this would have an impact on demography, but we can also think that the a bit stalled fertility decline that happened in the recent years, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa, might be due to in part to the low quality of education that restrains the possibility to use this education in high level jobs. So, and this is about close to my conclusion. We are a bit at the moment, I think, and I think the Daniele will also talk about this, and Emily possibly also. So we are a bit at the end of a time in terms of theory, where the demographic transition is so far the model we are working for, but we have little ideas how this will continue into the future. And we don't know whether there will be a rebound or what could cause this rebound, because I mean, the evidence is very scattered at the moment in post-transition country. Migration might be the major determinant of future population growth at the national level. Of course, at the world level, it doesn't matter. People don't come from another planet, but this is very difficult. And what Anna Rothkirch said is the strengthening with fertility is nobody really knows what's going on, and I think it's true. And my last slide has nothing to do with my presentation at all, but it's a bit an advertisement. My institute is having every summer a Young Scientist summer program where we welcome some 50 PhD students for 3 months. These students are paid and they are integrated into the different programs that we have. And at the moment, the applications are open. It's until January. So if you are any of the listeners are in the second year of a PhD, around the second year of PhD, and would like to join IASA for 3 months, please do not hesitate to apply. You can also contact me. Last year we had 2 students in the PubJust program from South Korea, and I think they had a very good time and they benefited. That's it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Goujon. It's very interesting. It was you first in one of the first slides, you said that projections is different from prediction or forecast, and I'm interested in learning more about that. Anyway, these scenario-based projections look very interesting. So let's move on to the second presentation. The second presentation will be delivered by Professor Daniele Vignoli, who is a professor of demography at the University of Florence. And he is the president of Italian Association for Population Studies, and he's also scientific director of the PhD program in life course research, scientific coordinator of the University of Florence Population and Society Unit, and he's also the co-director of the initiative Florence Population Studies. And in 2023, he received the European Demographer Award from Population Europe and the network of Europe's foremost demographic research institutes. His recent studies have appeared in Demography and Population and Development Review. So please welcome Professor Daniele Vignoli. To start.
Yes, I hope you can see my slides. Good morning, everyone. Do you see them?
Yes.
Yes. Now, yes. So, thank you very much for the invitation. It is really a pleasure for me to be here with you today and to share some ideas and reflections about low fertility, and just anticipated that someone is saying that nobody knows exactly what is happening about fertility decline, and I'm focusing especially on high-income countries. Historically, sudden economic shocks have left a clear imprint on annual fertility rates. The Great Depression of the 1930s is an example when a rapid increase in unemployment was followed by a drastic drop in fertility. And the oil price shock of 1973 is another historical example of how recessions lead to lower fertility. And we do have also a contemporary example, the Great Recession. This figure is probably well known to many of you. Fertility reversal after 2008 was especially pronounced in countries and regions that experienced stronger economic downturn and faster increases in unemployment. But what is especially unique by this recent crisis is that, differently from the crisis of the past, this Great Recession arrived in a time in which fertility was, at least in Europe, increasing in many countries. So there is a discontinuity in the fertility trend. And this discontinuity in the fertility trend is not only a temporary phenomenon. If we continue following our trends, you see that we are now dealing with a relatively homogeneous fertility decline across many high-income countries. Norway reached its lowest total fertility in history in 2022. Finland also reached its lowest fertility in history in 2022, 1.3, almost the same level in Finland as in Italy. 1.3 children per woman, down from 1.9 in 2010. Even in France, we are used to have France as a benchmark in terms of family policies. Fertility is progressively declining. And the black line here in the graph is Italy. Of course, we were starting from a very low level, so we cannot go much down, but still, every year we have an erosion in our fertility level. And fertility now is closer to our historical minimum in 1995 than our rebound in 2008, and now fertility in Italy is 1.2 children per woman on average. And these are just a few examples of a very generalized fertility decline of many high-income countries. The question is why, and the central explanation that I will put forward in this presentation is the rise of uncertainty. The increasing speed, dynamics, and volatility of outcomes of globalization, the new wave of technological change make it increasingly difficult for individuals to predict their future and choose between alternatives and strategies. The Great Recession just renewed the view that globalization is unpredictable and out of control. This state of affairs generates an extraordinary level of contingent uncertainty that sums up to a fundamental uncertainty that is always related to the decision of having a child. You don't know what will happen with a child, which represents, I think, this contingent uncertainty, the game changer in contemporary societies and family life courses. How can we operationalize this idea of uncertainty? At the macro level, I refer to a recent study conducted by Tomasz Sobotka and Anna Matysiak, which is published in European Journal of Population. In this study, we applied a three-level growth curve model on 251 European regions. And we found quite surprising findings. In Western Europe, and especially in Nordic countries, fertility rates were not closely associated with recession indicators, with classical recession indicators like the rise of unemployment, long-term unemployment. Our findings rather suggest the salience of other factors, like the subjective perception of uncertainty that we could not capture in our models. But this kind of subjective aspects may have rose predominance during the Great Recession. Moving from the macro level to the micro level, at the micro level, empirical tradition operationalizes the forces of uncertainty through objective indicators of actual and past individuals' labor market situation, and at best, their subjective perception. Nowadays, in demographic and sociology journals, paper addressing the relation between fertility and unemployment, fertility and temporary employment are now booming. There is an explosion of this kind of papers that are trying to link labor market performance and fertility. I'm not reviewing a specific study, but I mentioned this publication in Demography that is a meta-analysis of all what has been published until 2019 about the effect of employment instability on fertility, the effect of unemployment and jobs with limited time, with limited duration on fertility. Apart from several key findings from the study, the take-home message here is that although not negligible, the effects of unemployment and limited time employment on fertility are not of major magnitude. So something else is at play. And this kind of analysis, micro-level analysis, I love this kind of analysis. I'm for sure will continue to address this kind of studies, but they are unable to explain what is actually happening. For example, what are the driving forces of the fertility decline in Nordic countries after a Great Recession that in hard numbers they really never experienced, or at least not to any relevant extent? And what are the driving forces of such a generalized fertility decline that European societies are currently facing? My argument is that we need to roll back to the original definition of economic uncertainty, and we were failing in the way we were operationalizing uncertainty. Uncertainty primarily means the lack of clarity about future economic prospects, unknown probability distributions to possible outcomes. So already from this clear definition of uncertainty, uncertainty is about the future, is not about the present or the past. And cumulative employment disadvantage and its perception just identify what we can refer to as the statistical shadow of the past and tell us little about uncertain futures. We think that to properly address the effects of uncertainty on family dynamics, we need to change perspective, recognizing that economic uncertainty is a forward-looking notion. So uncertainty needs to be conceptualized and operationalized, taking into account that people use works of imagination, producing their own narrative of the future. Uncertainty is anchored in narratives that are imagined futures embedded in social elements. So personal narratives of the future are potent, driving forces of reproductive decisions in spite of uncertainty or according to uncertainty, quite irrespective of structural constraints and their subjective perception. To operationalize the role of uncertainty on family dynamics and to offer the proper theoretical premises for this kind of analysis, we have developed the so-called narrative framework, which provides the elements to operationalize uncertainty. Let me try to be a bit more analytical and to present this narrative framework. So the starting point is the fact that in the fertility decision-making process, we start as a first element from our past experience and the personal predispositions, risk aversion, loss aversion, and so on. Then the second element is our present status, our actual economic condition. After all, cumulative past experiences, personal predispositions over the life course, and the present status are the standard element usually employed as determinants of fertility, intentions, and behaviors in the great majority of demographic and sociological papers. The next level concerns the perception of a personal condition. Michaela Kreinfeld, in her article in 2010 in European Sociological Review, pioneered all the new strand of literature in which perception were added as a key element in the decision-making process. She emphasized that people with the same employment condition might, however, differ in the way they feel, tolerate, and react to uncertainty. Altogether, these three elements, past experience, status, and perceptions, are what we can refer to as the shadow of the past of the decision-making process. This is what is usually employed in our fertility modeling. But fertility decisions are not merely a shadow of the past. The specter of the future also matters. The additional first element to be considered is expectations. Expectations represent what people expect will happen in the future based on their available information. Then, in addition to expectation, we do have imaginaries. Individuals have agency and may wish a future irrespective of their actual conditions. And then the final element of the narrative framework are the narratives of the future, based on the shadow of the past, based on the expectations and our goal, our wishful future. People project themselves into an actionable future, their narrative of the future. So what I'm adding here is that in addition to the shadow of the past, what is rising importance under uncertainty is also the shadow of the future in our decision-making process regarding fertility. And clearly, all these different elements that influence the decision-making process are deeply influenced by the social context and especially in our time by shared narrative shared by media, social media, the press. I give you an example, 3 simple words, whatever it takes, pronounced by the then president of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, proved strong enough to debunk a global financial speculation against the euro in 2012. Of course, the European Central Bank was ready to unleash its monetary power, but this was unnecessary. The narrative of a new attitude of the European Central Bank for the future was enough. This is a textbook example in economic sociology to suggest that actors, social actors, take decisions also irrespective of the structural constraints. The new narrative of the future also matters. Clearly, these personal narratives of the future are anchored in existing cultural and institutional frames. They are strongly shaped by the media. Look at this, for instance, in the New York Times. Are you ready for the financial crisis of 2019? We were far from the Great Recession and still not in the COVID-19 pandemic. And still, the media were constantly talking about new recessions. And this has been also reinforced not only by uncertainty seeping into our lives from the economic domain, but also uncertainty seeping into our lives also from a more social and political domain. This is an example from an article from The Guardian, My Brexit Nightmare, readers on how the uncertainty is affecting their lives. There is also a change in the way we talk about uncertainty in the media, from presenting facts into directly entering into the lives of individuals. And from the most recent Eurobarometer survey, the most important fear of Europeans is now political instability. So this global political uncertainty has reinforced the narrative of an uncertain future among citizens. This is our narrative framework. So the key point is that to really understand what is happening to fertility nowadays is that we need to add a key element, the shadow of the future and the narratives of the future. The focus on past and actual structural constraints and their subjective perception is not enough to explain what is happening. Net of factors, and I use net of factors in the sense that in our statistical modeling, we still need to control for present status and past employment, but we also need to add the shadow of the future. How to do this in practice is not easy, but in a series of projects we coordinated here at the University of Florence, we tried to operationalize narratives of the future as determinant of fertility intentions and behaviors. And I give you an example based on cross-country laboratory experiment we conducted. And the key paper is here published in the European Journal of Population. So what we did is to organize cross-country lab experiments to assess the role of different economic narratives of the future on fertility intentions. We had 423 couples coming to our labs in Florence and 438 in Oslo. The sample is women and men in their reproductive ages, and the data collection was conducted prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is not affected by the uncertainty by the COVID-19 that served actually as a multiplier of uncertainty. In the lab, here colors symbolize any differentiating attribute among the individuals participating in our lab, and in the lab we even collected person-specific risk aversions of our participants. Then mock newspaper stories were used as treatment to manipulate respondents' perception of a critical situation. 1/3 of our sample was exposed to a positive, stable economic narrative of the future, 1/3 to a negative economic narrative of the future, and then we had our control group. Finally, we ask, as an outcome variable, do you intend to have a child in the next 3 years, which is a classical fertility intention question that is known to be a quite good proxy of subsequent behaviors. You see that this is Florence. In Florence, those who were exposed to, in a scale from 0 to 10, the fertility intention, how likely is that you will have a child in the next 3 years? Those exposed to the positive scenario have an average fertility intention of 7.1, negative scenario 4.2, and no scenario 5.3. While in Oslo, we have essentially the same situation in which the positive scenario is less effective, while the negative scenario is more effective. In a lab, this automatically controls for any alternative explanation, and this is already a causal effect. But of course, we also run regressions to also clean the estimations from and be able to improve the external validity of our findings. And these are predicted fertility intentions based on the 3 scenarios, no scenario, negative scenario, and positive scenario, net of many confounders at the individual level. You see, again, exactly the same finding. The narrative of the future was clear to determine fertility intentions, with Florence more subject to the positive narrative of the future, and Oslo more subject to the negative narrative of the future. And this is quite straightforward. This is called in social psychology distant experience. The narrative is more effective if it is far from your daily life. And in Italy, we are used to a more turbulent economic scenario, so it's the positive narrative of the future, the positive news that are effective. While in Oslo, in Norway, they are more used to a stable and prosperous economic context, so it's the negative news that do have an effect. We also published several other papers in which we clearly show effects of the narratives of the future in a time of uncertainty as determinants of fertility. Please feel free to email me if you want to know more about our papers. We also worked on the effect of media and social media, on observational studies, not only on experiments, and we also conducted qualitative research. I just mentioned one key paper that was also published in Demography. We were able to link the economic news coded daily for 20 years from the main evening newscasts in Italy on behaviors. And we do find a clear effect of how the economic news were pitched by our main news, main evening newscast. It had an effect on fertility. So really, it is not only actual and structural constraints, but it is also the media narrative that has an effect. So I think that it's true, it's really something that we don't know, the future of fertility, but more research is needed to address the role of personal and shared narratives of the future in the study of family dynamics across time and space, in the era of globalization, technological change, COVID-19 pandemic, and also now the war. The key challenge is to change our perspective. For many years, we were focusing in analyzing the differences between Italy and Norway. Now, I think the key point is to analyze the commonalities. What is the underlying cause of the similar trend impacting both Italy and Norway? And a very promising line of investigation for the future is also to enlarge the concept of uncertainty from the economic domain also to the social political domain. And also it can be that there is a generalized change in preferences that could be endogenous or exogenous to the role of uncertainty. So thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Professor Vignoli. The experiments, the findings from the experiments are really interesting. Okay, so we'll have some time to discuss more about that. Okay, so let's move on to our final presentation today. The final presenter is Professor Emily Grundy. She's a professor at the University of Essex, and she's a professor for the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Essex. So Professor Grundy joined the University of Essex in 2017 as professor of population science in the Institute for Social and Economic Research, and served as institute director from 2017 to 2020. Before joining ISER, she was a professor of demography at the London School of Economics. She's a demographer whose research has focused on health, disability, and mortality at older ages, family and household change, family life courses, and later life health and well-being, and so on. And Professor Grundy has been awarded numerous UK and international grants, including an ERC Advanced Grant, and has served as the president of the British Society for Population Studies, and so on. And she's a fellow of the British Academy and of the Academy of Social Sciences. Some of her recent works have been published in Social Science and Medicine, and Frontiers in Public Health, and Journal of the Royal Statistical Society series. Okay, so Professor Grundy, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. Really exciting initiative. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
So so how do I move them on though? Will you do that or how do
Yeah,
I?
just say next or something. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about family life courses and intergenerational influences on health and well-being in later life, and mainly focusing on Europe. So next slide, please. Yeah. So we know that family has a very large effect on older people's well-being, both in terms of emotional and practical help. And so studies of older people show that they regard the family as one of the most important domains of life. And we know there are large differences in health and mortality by marital and fertility history as well as status. And that even in this day of, YouTube and Zoom, it seems that for older people, it's actually face-to-face contact is still very important. So studies from the US, for example, found that it was only actually physically seeing family and friends which seemed protective against depression, not other forms of contact, although of course this might change. And there are associations too between living alone, few social contacts, and things like cognitive decline, which I will show you. And increasingly too, those who lack close family, they may need more formal services. So all of these are things which would suggest that how positive effects of family, but we must also remember that families can be particularly stressful, family histories may be difficult, and those accumulated stresses may have negative effects. But of course, in all this demographic work, it's extremely difficult to sort of unpick all of these influences, because there are many other things that families have in common, genetic and environmental factors, which may make it difficult to unpick the actual effect of particular associations. And reverse causation. Quite often we find in studies that older people who get the most social support, which we think of as protective, in fact have the worst health, and that may be because they're getting that support because of their health problems. And we just heard this nice example from Danielle about a lab experiment, but in general we can't randomize family behaviors, and it's very hard to find kind of instrumental variables, all of which make unpicking these associations difficult. And now in Europe, I think one thing is the historical context is completely different from countries like South Korea, in that until quite recently, we've actually had essentially an increase in the availability of close family for older people. First of all, we had reduced mortality, especially among men, has increased the proportion of people who are still married, and meant age of widowhood comes later, although I will show you there are very large regional differences. And secondly, those born in the 1940s had very high rates of marriage and parenthood, uniquely so in the European context. And so they had less childlessness than either earlier or later cohorts. But this is beginning to change with those born from the 1950s having different types of behaviour, lower fertility again, and also these kind of behaviours we think of as associated with the second demographic transition. So more divorce, cohabitation, non-marital childbearing. But this context, I think, is very interestingly, in terms of huge difference between perhaps the European history and the South Korean context, in that this slide shows the proportion of women at selected ages who had no living child. So that this slide shows the proportion of women at various ages with no living child. So the ages shown are 70, 80 and 90, because of course some people still, their children predecease them. But the main influence on these proportions is fertility, whoever had a child. So we see in Britain, Finland and France, the proportions of women, older women with no living child, are lowest for those born in the kind of 1940s, and are increasing for later born due to increased childlessness again. But I think what is interesting perhaps is the historical context too, is that if we look at, say, women born in the 1920s, those cohorts also had very high levels of childlessness, maybe up to 20% or something. So the situation in European countries now of low fertility, increasing proportions with no children, it's kind of different in some ways from the past, but it's not completely unique. We have had this before, and we've often had a quite reasonable minority of people with no children. Whereas in Korea, it's the childlessness that you now have is sort of completely new, really. So this study by Hwang, which was published in Demography recently, shows the percent childless by age 40 by birth cohorts, and these absolutely tiny proportions until we really get to very recent. So although in Europe we may have got some historical experience of quite large proportions of older people who have not had immediate family in terms of a child, this is new in some other countries like Korea. And the next slide, please. And as I say, the other kind of behavior, which is now much more common in many populations, is this marital dissolution, repartnering, more complicated marital and fertility patterns. So this slide shows the proportion who'd ever divorced by age 55 for various European countries. And so in Sweden, we can see that this is really, which is often a kind of forerunner of patterns of behavior, demographic behavior, getting on for sort of half of those born 1946 to 50 had ever divorced. Of course, many of them repartnered, and there are now quite high proportions of families with blended children from different partnerships and so forth. And we still, I don't think, really know enough about how those types of bonds will play out in terms of support exchanges in later life. The next slide, please. So in general, we know that in European countries, there are important socioeconomic as well as regional differences in patterns of intergenerational support. And in general, the support from children to older parents tends to be associated with lower levels of education, parental need, more so in southern than northern Europe, but reciprocity is very important. But from older parents to adult children, this tends to be the more advantaged groups who are more likely to give downward transfers. But a very important negative influence on both providing and receiving support is having been divorced, particularly divorced man. And there are some differences between social groups. These differences between social groups are kind of less common in southern than in northern Europe. Next slide, please. So in our work, or much of our work, we've been looking how fertility histories and the availability of children influence health in later life. And these may be both direct and indirect effects. There are certain consequences of pregnancy and childbirth for women, costs and benefits of child rearing and interaction, and of course also important selective influences too. But a whole range of studies generally suggest that somehow parents of about 2 to 4 children have the best health in later life, compared with either the childless or those with only one child, or parents of large families. The next slide, please. So this is one example of this. These are looking at fertility and all-cause mortality at ages 45 to 80, using data from the whole Swedish population. And these are models which try to use sibling control methods to try and eradicate some of the bias in this. And all of these models, including, you know, various levels of control, education, time-varying marital status, and so forth, also show this pattern of highest mortality among the childless, lowest among those with sort of two children. This is on the right-hand panel, and then higher again for parents of large families, and also differences by age at first birth, with high mortality for those with early childbearing. And of course, even though we try to use methods like the sibling comparison, a lot of this must be due to various selective influences. Next slide, please. And similar sort of pattern. This is data from SHARE from Europe, looking at depression scores and limitations of activities of daily living according to age at first birth. And we see that in general, disadvantages for women with very early childbearing. Next slide, please. And in other work, we've looked at the influence of fertility histories on cognitive function and cognitive change in later life. And these are using data from the English longitudinal study of aging. So we've got parenthood history and control for a range of factors: education, wealth, various physical measures of health, smoking, and also things like social isolation and social support. Next slide, please. And these models suggest that the number of children change in cognitive function by parity. Again, we see the sort of least deterioration for those with kind of maybe 2 or 3 or more children, and more deterioration for the childless. And this is hypothetically is probably due to both these selective factors, but possibly also to kind of less social interaction with younger people. Next slide, please. And we also have been doing some work now trying to compare Eastern and Western Europe and looking at the availability of children in terms of influences on depression. And this arose really because we hypothesized that availability of children might be particularly important in the former Eastern Europe, in Eastern European countries, because there's much higher rates of widowhood. There's lower rates of childlessness compared to Western Europe, but also a lot more one-child families, and which might lead people to somehow regret their family building strategies in later life if they're reliant on one child only. And of course, the huge change in political and economic context with the end of the Soviet Union meant that for older people, their sort of expectations have not been borne out, a completely different context in which they're growing old. So this is an example of where uncertainties have sort of really happened. So we wondered then and wanted to examine whether children were kind of more important for mental health in later life in Eastern than Western European countries. So the next slide, please. Right, okay. So we use this analysis is based on data from the Gender and Generations surveys, and we looked at variation in depressive symptoms by partnership and number of children, country fixed effects models, and able to look cross-sectionally at quite a large selection of Eastern countries, and the Western ones, Belgium, France, Norway, and Sweden. Unfortunately, fewer longitudinal data available. Next slide, please. So the kind of headline results were level of depressive symptoms among older people much higher in Eastern than Western Europe, and lots of studies have shown this. Unpartnered had more depressive symptoms than the partnered, and this was a stronger effect in Eastern countries. And as you might expect, financial strain, worse physical health were also associated with depression. Education was protective. And in Eastern but not Western countries, childlessness and having only one child rather than 2 or more was also associated with more depressive symptoms. And in terms of the longitudinal work, parents who had infrequent contact children with their children had greater increases in depressive symptoms. So next slide, please. So this is just an illustration of these findings. This shows the predicted number of mean depressive symptoms by partnership status and number of children, and this is for older people. And you can see that the East, which is the red color, levels of depression are higher, both among those with a spouse and those not living with a spouse. but the relationship with number of children is stronger in the East, with the most highest number of depressive symptoms among those with no children. Next slide, please. So, of course, one potential way in which family exchanges of support are maybe operationalized is through co-residence. And in much of Europe, this isn't nearly as common as in other parts of the world, of course, particularly Asia. But even so, co-residence is an important sort of element of intergenerational exchanges, and it's becoming kind of maybe becoming more important again after a long period of reductions in co-residence. And co-residence might have positive or negative effects on later life well-being, and partly because of the differences in the circumstances that lead to co-residence, and partly perhaps to different social contexts and availability of non-family support. So potential disadvantages are reduced autonomy, possible conflict, but benefits may include companionship, economies of scale, and of course there are important influences or interactions, if you like, with housing and some environmental benefits of more co-residence. So next slide, please. So this shows results from an analysis of the European Social Survey, looking at outcomes like happiness and life satisfaction. And in this study, we examined associations between these outcomes and co-residence for widows aged 65 and over. And what it shows is that in general, widows living with a child are happier than those not living with a child, who are basically living alone. But in Eastern and Southern Europe, it was only living with a daughter which had this beneficial effect. So this may obviously be something to do with what daughters do rather than sons do, but also the pathways that lead you to be living with a son rather than a daughter. Next slide, please. And more recently, we've been examining the effects of either children moving back to live with parents or parents on the welfare of both the older and the younger generation. So in some work in European countries, we found that when an adult child returned home, it was associated with a decline in parental quality of life, but this was mainly driven by effects in Nordic countries. And other things, this is very much following on from Elder's concept of linked lives. Things that happen in the adult child's life have an effect on the parental well-being. So children who experience divorce, their older parents' quality of life declines as well. So, and in further work, Marco Tosi looked particularly at Britain and found that this sort of negative effect on the older parents' well-being of the child returning home was generally fairly short-lived, except where the child was unemployed. Next slide, please. So this is just this illustration of what happened to parents' quality of life when the adult child returned home, which, as you can see, is particularly a negative effect in Nordic countries where there's strong norms about sort of independence, if you like. Next slide, please. So more recently, we've been looking at what happened to the young people's mental well-being when they return to their parents. And this is becoming, in many European countries and the US, I'm not so sure about Korean context, there's been quite a big increase in proportion of young people living with parents and delays in all kinds of traditional markers of adulthood. So later home leaving, later partnership, later, and of course in some cases no childbearing. So if we can see that 2018 to 19, the proportion of 19 to 29-year-olds living with their parents is higher than it had been in the late 1990s. And illustrate this is that of young adults living with their parents, they're quite a high proportion have got some mental health problem, much higher proportion than among young adults altogether who are not living with their parents. Next slide, please. So in this work, we wanted to look at what effect does it have on the young person's well-being when they return to the parental home. So we use data from a large longitudinal study of the UK population. We've been able to follow these people from for about 10, 11 years. And during this period, about 15% of adults in the age range 21 to 35 move back to the parental home at least once. So it's quite a high proportion. Next slide, please. And we were expecting that these young adults who had to move back to their parents or chose to move back to their parents would experience a deterioration in their mental health. We looked at changes using fixed effects models. And of course, we did find that things like poor mental health and partnership dissolution were increased the chance of returning to the parental home. But when we looked at changes in young adults' mental health, if anything, we found that it improved when they returned to the parental home. Next slide, please. So this is just indication of this. Sorry, could you advance that, please? Because next, yeah, that's it. So these are measures of mental health using the General Health Questionnaire and the MCS. So for women, these young women who returned to the parental home, if anything, their mental health improved a bit, although no changes for men, but no deterioration. Next slide, please. So, right. So to try to come to some conclusion, and I apologise that I wasn't able to show the slides myself, which has rather kind of slightly disrupted my presentation. Family life courses and living arrangements are major influences on health and well-being in later life, and intergenerational relationships and exchanges are important for both older and younger people. Things that happen in one generation affect the well-being of other generations, but there are these very important contextual influences as well as variations between different social groups and between different regions. And I think perhaps the sort of biggest issue that we have now is that in Europe we have there's kind of quite long experience, if you like, of older people who haven't got their own children, but in the past may have had more availability of things like nieces and nephews. Whereas in countries like Korea, this is perhaps a kind of newer experience, and it's be unclear about the alternative kind of sources of support. And I think also that these things show that when we think about, say, young people's fertility choices now, this will affect not just their future, but also the well-being perhaps of their own older parents, who, whether or not they have grandchildren, may influence their well-being. And that it does seem that we heard from Danielle that this important influence of uncertainty, but of course in the past having children might in some ways have been an insurance against other types of uncertainty, and might lead to people to regret their choices later, whereas we don't know, it seems now to be a rather different context of decision making around the world. So thank you very much, and that's my end of my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Grundy. There was some like technical glitch in the beginning, but well, it ended beautifully. So yeah, thank you for your presentation. It contains a lot of information and insights, and the presentation was very rich. So now we have, according to our original plan and schedule, we have like 6 minutes left, but maybe we can, extend it like by 4 minutes, and maybe have like 10-minute Q&A and discussion. So there were no like questions from our online audience, so maybe I can just throw some questions, or maybe we can have some like questions among us, among the presenters. So I have like 1 or 2 questions for each presenter. So for Professor Goujon, it was really. I'm not very familiar with this kind of projection kind of studies, so it was really interesting. I had like just 2 brief questions. So the first question is related to what I already mentioned right after your talk. So what is the difference between like projection and forecasting and prediction? So maybe projection here is used as a kind of a well-defined technical term. So there would be some definitional differences between these 3 terms. So that is the first question. And the second question is that in page 25 or something like that, titled "What will be the impact of loss in education quality?" So I was not really clear why this could be a question, because it says increase in school quantity at the expense of school quality. So are you talking about this in the context of developing countries? Because, for example, in Korea, there's rapid decline in student population. So the school quality is getting better actually, because there is no increase in school quantity, and I guess in most advanced, economically advanced, countries, school quantity is not increasing. So, are you talking about this mainly in the context of developing countries? So that was my question. And for Professor Vignoli, very interesting stuff. So according to, so you presented some kind of diagram that consists of kind of nested circles, right? That start from past experience, and finally narratives of the future start to appear. And what is exactly the role of the shadow of the past here. So I can I could completely understand what is the role, what the role of narratives of the future here, and how that affects, individuals' fertility intentions. But I think in this presentation, you didn't clearly kind of explain how the shadow of the past affect the shadow of the future, and how past experience and personality traits kind of create, eventually affect one's narratives of the future. And on the other hand, I was wondering, so you are focusing on the narratives of the future and how that is, how that influence individuals' fertility intentions. But I was also wondering, kind of, would there be something like narratives of the past? So I agree that narrative is very important concept, and it plays an important role in people making decisions in their lives. But you are talking about narratives of the future. So maybe there could be narratives of the present, and there could be narratives of the past. So there could be many other different kinds of narratives. So I was wondering, have you thought about that possibility? And the difference between Florence and Oslo was very interesting. And I think you explained what caused the difference. But can you just explain one more time what do you think caused this difference between the two countries? When I saw this difference, what came to my mind was this cross-cultural difference between, for example, East Asia and I think it was the United States, which is that, for example, students focus on their kind of negative traits or their lack of ability in something in East Asia. So in East Asian, students focus on their kind of, downsides, whereas in the United States, students tend to focus on more their merits and the positive aspects of themselves. So maybe Italy people are more sensitive to positive signals, and in Norway people are more sensitive to negative signals, maybe. But yeah. And Professor Grundy's talk, it was very interesting, especially the concept of linked lives was a very intriguing concept, and because you presented us so many findings and papers and graphs and so on and so on. I was wondering whether you could provide us with a very kind of big picture of how these linked lives play out differently across various European regions, with distinct cultural, social, economic landscapes. So that was my kind of thought, and obviously it seems like contacting with children is very important for the elderly, but I was wondering whether that includes physical visit or physical contact and phone calls and text message, so the contact with children includes all those kind of things, or whether physical visit is particularly more important and significant than other types of contacts, like virtual like text messages or phone calls and so on. So is there any kind of finding related to that? Okay, so that was my questions. So maybe Professor Goujon, can you start first?
Yes, I'll start first and I will be brief. Thank you for the questions. Yeah, sorry if my explanation was not here about what is the difference between predictions and forecast and projections. So predictions are not scientific. So anyone who predicts you something, you shouldn't trust this. Usually it's not based on anything. And what forecasts are more related to what a statistical institute do. So when they deliver their projections, they call them also projection, but it's mostly like they're varying a bit migration, they are varying a bit fertility, varying a bit mortality, but it's within a range that seems likely seen from today's perspective. Whereas in projections, and you've seen in some of my graphs where you have a wide range of of possibilities for the future. This is more about testing the sensitivity of the projections to different scenarios. So what if there's no migration in the future, incoming, outgoing for the country of Korea? What if fertility keeps declining with the trend that has been happening in the recent past? So you can play with more scenario to see the implication of some change. And to your second question, yes, you were right. So what I was talking about quality of education, this was related especially to less developed regions, less developed countries, where education, so enrollment has been increasing very fast, and somehow in many cases, because there is not the adequate increase in the number of teachers that are available, in the quality of the classrooms and so on. So there is a price to pay for this increase, and we're starting to see this. This is not the case. Exactly the case in more developed regions. Although I can also say from the experience of my country, France, this is at the time when the enrollment is increasing not as fast, or is even declining. I don't see the commensurate increase in quality. So it doesn't mean that the government, the policy makers are going to put more or the same amount of funding to education. So there also could be a choice, like it could be an occasion to cut on education expenses at that moment. So that doesn't mean that there would be a commensurate increase due to population decline. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Professor Vignoli? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for the questions. I will also try to be brief. I first would like to react to Emily Grandi's point about having a child as an insurance, that it's true, and the reaction to uncertainty is not necessarily fertility postponement or fertility renunciation. There is a very interesting paper that initiated also the literature on uncertainty in demography in 1995 about uncertainty reduction framework, which is the easiest strategy from the paper is for ordinary individuals in the United States when they are exposed to uncertainty is to marry and have children, because at least they have a fixed point in life. The idea of linked lives is also that if you have blocked opportunities in one domain, like in the economic domain, you focus on a competing domain that is, in this case, having children. So uncertainty and reacting to uncertainty is not necessarily fertility postponement or renunciation. In terms of the shadow of the past, I think, and I've been working for many years on the shadow of the past as a determinant of fertility. It is still crucial, and I was writing in my slides, net of factors means that in all the statistical models we have, we need to control for cumulative past experiences in the economic domain. Net of this factor, we can evaluate the shadow of the future. It is not only a confounder, it can also be a moderator. So the idea is also that different social groups may have a different reaction to the narratives of the future. So the shadow of the past is absolutely crucial into this narrative framework. Each element of the flowers, let's say, exceeds the previous one, but is not fully determined by the previous one. And then the narratives of the past and the narratives of the present is also a very fascinating topic. I really believe in the effect of the narratives of the past. I'm now conducting a research comparing Italy and the UK about the parental narratives of the importance of having a permanent job. That in Italy, all our young generations are exposed to a shadow of the past, a narrative of the past in which they need to have a permanent employment, while in the UK it is not absolutely the case. So there is also a different impact of the narrative of the past. I really think that apart from narratives of the future of the past, irrespective of the structural constraints, our narratives are gaining importance in understanding the decision-making process for fertility. Thank you.
Okay, now it's time to wrap up our today's symposium. I'd like to thank all the three presenters from Europe, and I also like to thank all the participants from who joined this symposium through YouTube. We'll stop here for today's event, and please pay attention to our YouTube channel, SNU Pop Seoul National University Pop Center. We'll upload more of our events and conferences on this YouTube account. So I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.